Hi, and welcome to the third and final summit celebrating NAFSA's 75th anniversary. This summit is called The Future of International Education, Advancing the Mission. And it's fitting to me that this final summit takes place in the U.S. International Education Week, because the theme of International Education Week this year is International Education is the Future. And specifically, the theme for today, November 16th, is Innovate the Future. So very fitting this topic. My name is Caroline Donovan White, and I'm the Senior Director for Education Abroad and Volunteer Engagement here on the NAFSA staff, and I'll be facilitating our discussion today. I want to remind you all that today's event is being recorded, and we'll be sending a link to all of the registrants along with some resources mentioned here in a few days after this event. So today, we're going to look to the future. And for that, we'll think about, 5 to 8 years out, 2030. So not necessarily the next 75 years, but the next bit that we can be thinking about in the office. At any point during this presentation, I invite you to put questions in the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen. It really helps us if you put your questions there as opposed to the chat, so we can find them quickly when we get to the panel. Joining me today, we'll have a variety of what I'd like to call, if I may, international education luminaries, and perhaps a new voice for many of you. You can read their full bios online, and my colleague will post the link to those bios in the chat. We'll have Dr. Fanta Ah, who's Executive Director and CEO here at NAFSA at our staff office in Washington, D.C. Marcus Body is CEO of ISEF, a global market leader in business-to-business networking events and agent training. He is kind enough to be joining us at the start of his vacation from the Seychelles. Dr. Harvey Charles is the Vice Provost for International Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Jesus Rosario is a Senior Partnerships Manager at Coursera, and he's based in California. Finally, a new voice for the NAFSA community, perhaps, is Tessa Finleb, founder of Facilitating Foresights, a future-focused firm that looks at building capacity and facilitating new skills and insights rooted in strategic foresight. She's joining us from Kenya. We'll be together for the next 90 minutes or so for what I know will be an engaging discussion. Our plan today is we'll start with Tessa and learn more about strategic foresight. I'm excited to learn more about that process. After her framing, each panelist will offer some thoughts about how that approach resonates with their work and touching on implications for the future. Finally, we'll take your questions from the audience, both some that you submitted in advance and some that you'll be giving us today. Tessa, I'm going to invite you to join me on screen, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you to talk about the practice of strategic foresight. What does that work look like? How can we foster a culture of using that in our work in higher education? Thanks, Tessa.
Thank you, Caroline. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. And before I get into strategic foresight, I want to take a minute to recognize the work that everybody here does. As I've come to learn more about the field, I've been very humbled by the work that you all do and the grand mission of peace and justice and soft diplomacy, preparing people for a globalized world. These are values that resonate very strongly with me, and they're also very relevant to where the world is headed. So international education is needed more than ever, and I want to thank you for the work that you do, even when it's hard. So as Caroline mentioned, I'm a foresight strategist, and what this means is I work with organizations and companies and governments around the world to understand different possible futures and how those potential futures might impact the decisions that are being made today. And I want to kick off the conversation about strategic foresight with a conversation around, it's just a little story about international education and how it has touched my life. I want to root this conversation about the future in a little bit of the past of international education, perhaps. So when I graduated college, I joined the Peace Corps, and I've come to learn that's quite common for people in this field. So I imagine there are many of you on here who can relate to that experience. And when I was in the Peace Corps, I became friends with a woman named Angela. And within about the first year of our friendship, I introduced her to a education nonprofit. And I didn't really think much about it beyond that. It was a simple task on my end, but one of her children ended up getting a scholarship to a good high school. And this was in Kenya. And in Kenya, you have to pay for secondary school. So this was a really big thing. And that high school scholarship transitioned into a university scholarship where she went to the US to go to university. This was about 15 years ago that the whole chain of events kicked off. And last week, I went to visit Angela after about 6 years. I hadn't seen her. And I was just blown away by the change that I saw. When we were first friends, she had a very typical house for rural Kenya, made of wood and sheet metal, no electricity, no running water, no indoor bathroom. And now she has this beautiful stone house, running water, electricity, indoor bathroom, indoor kitchen. And her daughter now works for Whole Foods in data analytics, and she works from Kenya about 5 months of the year. And I mean, that's just spectacular. I would never have known that that would have been the result. And, this is the impact of the work that you do. That's the impact of international education. The cycle of poverty has been broken for that family. It's pretty fantastic. I share the story to highlight that we cannot predict how the decisions we make today will impact the future, but they do impact the future. I had no idea that Karen would get sponsorship and that would take her all the way to the US for university and impact her family so greatly. And simultaneously, we can't predict how changes in the external environment will change our lives and the fields that we work in. Bottom line is we can't predict the future. But continuing with Karen's story for just a minute here. 15 years ago, when this whole chain of events kicked off, I would never have imagined that she would be working in Kenya for an American high-end grocery store chain in rural Kenya, half of the year. Just think about that. 15 years ago when all this kicked off, I was using a dumb Nokia phone. For those of you who might remember those are the phones where you just have the numbers on the screen and you have to push each number like 3 times to get the right letter. There was no Facebook. There was no Wi-Fi in rural Kenya. There was no pandemic. There was no COVID that opened up this global imagination around working from anywhere. And so the world of today is very different from the world of 15 years ago. And this was also before I was trained as a foresight strategist, as a futurist. I, at the time, wasn't paying attention at all to what kinds of futures might evolve and emerge in unexpected ways. And how maybe I could use some of those nuggets of information to shape the decisions that I was making. I was not engaging in futures research. And I had not unlocked my futures imagination yet. So this gets at the heart of why we're here today, why I'm here today. So NAFSA is celebrating 75 years as an association. This is a huge milestone, and it's a very natural moment to explore what the future might look like. So how does one go about this, right? It seems like a very big task, especially when I say there is no such thing as predicting the future. That's simply impossible. The world is far too complex. There's no way with any certainty we could say anything about what will happen 5 years from now, 7 years from now, let alone tomorrow. Although the closer in time frame, the more certainty you have, the further out in time frame, the more complex and more open the potential opportunities become. So what is strategic foresight? Strategic foresight is the systematic exploration of possible futures, from the good to the bad, and then the analysis of those possible futures to support decision-making today. And as a field, as a discipline, it's been around in a formalized way since maybe the 1960s or so. There are universities around the world who offer degrees in futures thinking or strategic foresight. There's a university in Hawaii, University of Manoa in Hawaii, that offers a PhD in this field. There's a University of Houston that offers master's degree, and there are universities around the world that offer various certifications and degrees in futures thinking. So there is a rigorous discipline around researching possible futures and then using those stories about possible futures to inform decision-making today. As an organizational discipline, we can look to the US military as an early user of scenario planning, simulation, wargaming. These are ways to pre-experience possible futures so that should they arrive, you've already mentally been through them and are more able to adapt quickly rather than being stuck in shock. And Shell Oil, so unfortunately, US military and the Shell Oil Corporation are the early starters of using futures thinking as an internal discipline. And Shell Oil started with scenario planning in about 1960s. And the reason they did that is because they understood economic forecasting, which is the underpinning traditionally of how companies think about their future. Economic forecasting, when you take data from the past and you project it forward, tends to give you a very narrow view of what's possible. It tends to give you a view of what's possible based on slightly more and slightly less of what we have today. But that is not how the world works. The world is not linear. There are unexpected things that can come up, like COVID, like regime change, like a climate event, a new disruptive technology that changes the entire scope of what's possible. And so strategic foresight is a qualitative research discipline and application to help us explore the widest range of possible futures. And there are many, many different methodologies and structures for doing this. And you can use years to gain a deep understanding of the space. So in today's world, we're finding that strategic foresight is being used more and more by a wider range of audiences. And this is in large part because we're facing so much change and disruption and uncertainty all the time. And there's just information overload. Thanks to social media, thanks to 24-hour news, we're just getting a constant stream of information, and it's really hard to keep up. And it's really hard to make sense of it all. And strategic foresight is a discipline to help us conduct some of that sense making as we try to think through where are all these things that we're seeing happening today? Where are they taking us? Where might they be taking us? And how might we be able to use that information to shape the decisions that we're making today effectively? So why do we want to think about the future? One of the reasons is to think differently, to think more expansively. The other outcome, if you will, is that exploring possible futures forces it develops a very positive opportunity-based view of the world, because it pushes you outside of your typical frame of mind and into a much more expansive range of possibilities. And then that opens up new possibilities. We can also use it to re-energize and develop new grand visions and strategies, or to stress test and build resilience into the ones that we already have. If the world unfolds in this way, we have this, our strategy will be resilient. If it unfolds this way, it'll still be resilient. If it unfolds this way, it will still be resilient. And we use it to systematically make sense of the change that's happening around us, rather than just having all these headlines flying around and not having the time to actually sit down and think, well, what does this actually mean? What does this mean to me? What does it mean to my colleagues? What does it mean to my stakeholders? So when conducting strategic foresight, when trying to understand what the future might look like, and it's always the future in quotes, because there is no one future out there to be discovered. No matter how much research you do, you will never discover the one future, but there's a range of possibilities, from the good to the bad. And our job is to understand the range. And in order to do that, it's a team sport. You have to have people who are doing it with you. And you have to have a diverse group of people doing it with you, because there is no one owner of the future. There is no person who understands exactly everything. You have to have a whole range of people who are exploring possible futures, so that you can have a more broad, expansive understanding of what's possible. The way I'm going to interpret how blockchain technologies or generative AI or demographic shifts or changing international education is going to be quite different from how Fanta thinks about it. And in having that kind of dialogue back and forth, we grow and learn more deeply. And the way a young student might think about it is very different as well. So we have to have a diverse range of people who are engaging in this process in order to have a robust understanding of the whole range of futures. And of course, we have frameworks and methodologies to do that within. There are many different processes that you can learn and pull from. So I've said that there's no one future to predict or discover, right? That's also to say, the future doesn't really exist. We can't approach understanding the possible futures in the same way that we would approach social science research. We can't have a hypothesis and then collect data and then prove that right or wrong. But we can collect data today, and there are different ways in which futurists do this in order to develop plausible, logical, provocative stories about what the future might be like. So anytime we engage in futures thinking, we conduct research so that as I'm telling a story about a possible future, I can tell you, I don't know if this exact thing will happen. And I can't tell you with any certainty, but I do know it's possible. And here's exactly why. So I need to be able to walk you through from today to there so that you say, okay, I see it's possible. There's logic there. And now I can say, all right, so if this is a potential future for international education, what does that mean for us? How am I going to go about, what are some new opportunities for us? What are some new challenges for us? And in going through this kind of a process, and it's important to recognize that this is it's outside in process. So most of us in our day-to-day, we are focused on the near term, what's right in front of us, and we're focused on problem solving. So when we hear about new things happening in the external world, or even within our world, our immediate reaction is to pass judgment on it. Is it good? Is it bad? How do I solve it? How do I work with it? Part of the discipline of strategic foresight is taking out your judgment, your problem solving, and coming up to terms with your individual and your organizational bias and assumptions about the future. And we all have those implicitly. Running forward with generative AI, I'm going to have a different sense of how generative AI is going to impact the future of education from a young person who is building generative AI, from someone who uses it all the time in their day-to-day, from someone who's never had it. And so when we're exploring possible futures, we have to come to terms with those assumptions because we're trying to understand, without bias, what is the range of possible futures. And once we've done that, then we can narrow in to saying, okay, so what is the preferred ideal future that we're working towards? Or amongst all these futures, how do we make sure, regardless of how the world goes, we will remain resilient and able to move forward with our bigger, grander mission that is unwavering? So I will leave it at that and pass it back to Caroline, and looking forward to the ongoing conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tessa. I wrote down a couple of times about this idea of many futures because it is a helpful way to think about it, right? What are the many different possibilities there? And thanks so much for sharing that lovely story at the beginning of your remarks as well. I think it shows that you really know the types of people, why we care about this community, but also connected to that theme of the future. So now I'm going to invite the audience actually to reflect on some of what Tessa shared with us today. And as you consider how she discussed this strategic foresight, this thinking about the future, what themes for higher education come to your mind as you reflect on what she offered so far this morning? If you could type those themes in the chat, I'd appreciate it. And we'll come back to those later during this discussion. So now we'll have Marcus join us. We're going to have each panelist talk about the so what. In other words, what are the implications for strategic foresight to international education? What are the emerging themes? What are the obstacles? If we take what Tessa was talking to us about as framing, what does this keep in mind for some of the international educators we have joining us here on the call? Marcus, can you join me on screen?
Hello.
Thank you. We'll leave it to you for a little bit.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon. And thanks to the NAFSA team for having me tonight. And also like to say congratulations on your 75-year anniversary before I start. So I've seen quite a few people dialing in or saying hello from different parts of the US and the world. And I think it's going to be a very interesting session. When I was asked to think about opportunities, themes, and obstacles for the future of international education, I think there are two profound things going on, two profound shifts going on in the world today, which have got huge implications for the future of international education. One is the digital transformation that the whole world is going through, and the second is what I would call the demographic explosion. So in terms of digital transformation, we have it in all of our works of life, but specifically to international education, it is mainly interesting in two key areas. One is student recruitment, and the other is the delivery of education. So in terms of student recruitment, there's various tools and software platforms out there that are really revolutionizing the way recruiters and educators are working in terms of enrollment management systems, CRMs, student application platforms, artificial intelligence, of course, in many ways, and also peer-to-peer networking platforms. Those are just a few of the tools and platforms out there. And they're all quite different, but what they do have in common is that they all shorten time of processes which before would take days. They reduce them to hours, even seconds. They make great efficiencies in work. They remove tedious tasks. They make things go faster. And so this really is something which has profoundly changed the landscape of student recruitment since the pandemic, and increasingly so. Also, another one is, of course, international payment systems. The list is quite long. We might come back to talk more about that. So that's in terms of student recruitment. In terms of education delivery, no surprise, that's really the online learning part. It's been around for decades. It used to be called distance education. I can remember it quite well 30 years ago. But again, the pandemic has accelerated this in a big way. And most programs now have an online learning component. We're seeing the creation of mixed programs with so-called blended and hybrid programs, lots of immersive learning experiences, augmented reality, virtual reality, gamification. So that also has transformed the landscape of international education as we know it. Two other areas which are kind of related to technology is also the rise of new types of certifications, the rise of micro-credentials, mixed micro-credentials and degree programs, also T&E, transnational education, where students might start off in a campus, in a country, in a T&E campus, and then go to the destination to finish off. So all of this has created a whole new world in which studying is no longer on-site or is no longer in a certain place. An international student, by definition, is not somebody who has to get on a plane to go somewhere. An international student can study somewhere else in their own country. Everything is going faster. So I think that really has profound implications for the way the world is going. And I was speaking to a college professor just some weeks ago who said that on their campus already they don't differentiate between domestic and international students. They differentiate between online and offline students. So that's, I think, a very important thing to consider. The other factor is the demographic explosion. Now, before I talk about what I mean there, we've all seen these figures for years about how international students are increasing. And this trend has come back with a vengeance since the pandemic. Now, Hold On IQ, you might have heard the name, are predicting 9 million higher education students abroad alone by the year 2030, and the incredible sum of $433 billion US as a direct spend of international students. So the trend, as we've known it for the last 30 years, is continuing in a big way. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. If you look at the demographic explosion that we are already experiencing and will be experiencing much more in the next 10 to 15 years, it will be parts of the world are really growing enormously. One stat I heard recently, in 2030, one of four of all people between 15 and 24 years old will be in Africa. And up to 2050, 25% of world growth population will be in Central and South Asia. So the world is going to increase tremendously in certain areas. And all these people also want to have an education, an international education, because the world will increase to be ever more interconnected, as it always has been increasing. And where do they go? So these people can't necessarily get on a plane. They don't have the money necessarily. The cost of study abroad is prohibitive, the cost of travel, also visa ability, working opportunities. So these people also will need to study. And so what I just mentioned before becomes even more important. We're looking at a world where the demand for study of these people will need to be satisfied by all sorts of online micro-credential specific programs suited to their aspirations and their walks of lives. So I think that's about all I had to say about the future. I think that's about it for me for the moment. I think, Caroline?
Sure.
Okay.
All you have to say for now. We'll certainly come back to you later.
Okay, thanks. Cheers.
Next up, we'll have Jesus offer some reflections. And Marcus, I want to thank you for that sort of global perspective on what it looks like from sitting outside the United States. It's one of the main reasons we were so glad to have you join the panel today. So thank you for giving us some thoughts there. Jesus, thanks so much.
Thanks, Caroline, and thank you very much for everyone for having me. I'm honored and very excited to join these wonderful panelists and to join the conversation today. I think we can all agree that we live in an unprecedented time when it comes to technology. The digital revolution, like Marcus mentioned, which began late 20th century, is not something new, has changed how we communicate, how we work, how we learn. Technology continues to evolve exponentially. And like every other industry, higher education has been and will continue to be affected by these changes. Computers, the internet, and smartphones, all these technologies have made education more accessible and have created more opportunities for individuals to learn, to upskill, and to reskill, as Marcus mentioned, micro-credentials, online learning, and all these different modalities. More recently, modalities like virtual exchanges and augmented reality and online learning are providing more means for people to pursue credentials or to continue learning. The thing is that as I think about this and as I thought about what I was going to share, if you believe that it is hard to keep up with the last 10 years of innovation, you better buckle up, because thanks to the advent of generative AI, we're about to experience things that are straight out of a sci-fi movie. And as wonderful as these technologies are, they also create a series of challenges, many outside of this panel's scope. But I do want to point out a few that keep me up at night, especially around generative AI. And that is the digital literacy gaps among both students and learners in the higher education space, and digital equity gaps among our students that, if left unchecked, will eventually result in less opportunity for those who are already struggling to keep up. And this includes the availability of reliable internet access, the infrastructure to access internet, and the cost of services and subscriptions like AI. And you might be thinking to yourself, these challenges are not new. And you are correct. They've been present in our societies, across campuses, in every continent. What is new, though, is the rate at which the changes are taking place and will take place. Earlier this year, a paper published by the University of Pennsylvania estimated that up to 49% of workers in the United States could have half or more of their tasks exposed to a large language model like ChatGPT, for example, and that higher wages are associated with increased exposure to GPT. This year, the World Economic Forum Future of Job Reports estimated that by 2027, 61% of the workers, global workers, will require retraining. So we're about to witness a tremendous disruption in the labor force. But the equity gap could widen as the wages of those who learn to leverage these technologies grow and more people also could get left behind. So when we think about the disruption that generative AI will bring to the industry, it is much bigger than what we normally hear about the concerns around academic integrity. These technologies are not going anywhere, they're here to stay. And we need to learn how to help students and the people that we work with to become proficient in using them if we have their long-term success at heart. And this leads me to my second point about the gaps among higher education leaders. How can we ensure that the people we work with don't get left behind? And now I'm just talking about not just students, but also the leaders and future leaders in higher education. There's a tremendous opportunity to leverage these tools, especially generative AI, to provide more opportunity to people. But in order to do so, we need ourselves to familiarize with them and to understand the value they bring. Many of you might have seen ChatGPT or BART or one of these language models. Perhaps you've used them to write a poem or a clunky email, but there's so much more than that. Take ChatGPT, for example, OpenAI's model. Last year, OpenAI made ChatGPT available to the world. They opened it up at the end of November, so it's been only a few months. Back then, the model could provide slow but accurate responses to many of our prompts and had limited knowledge of current events. That same model today, it can analyze, do advanced data analysis. It has eyes, so you can upload images and it can basically speak as a human would. And this all happening within a year. And McKinsey published a report this year titled "The Economic Potential of Generative AI." And among all the occupation groups, including STEM professionals, healthcare, business, it found that among educators and workforce training, there are 3 times more job tasks which could be impacted by generative AI than any other group, interestingly enough. So what could that look like? There are several ways of leveraging the technology to make it more accessible for people to learn more. Initiatives like language translation that become more easily to generative AI, collaborative online learning, or COIL. It's another channel that technology opens up to give opportunities for more people to have an international experience. But at the end of the day, to quote from Fanta's word in the past, talent is a global opportunity. Talent is global, sorry, but opportunity isn't. And if you're watching this, most likely you have that opportunity. And it is our responsibility to become familiar with these tools and to leverage them for the betterment of our society. And all I have to say is that if you want to learn how to use them, it's just like riding a bicycle, right? You can watch videos online about riding a bicycle, but you won't learn until you hop on and give it a try. And you might fall a few times, but we need to be willing to do that work in order to familiarize ourselves with those tools if we want to create an impact and to open the opportunities to others.
Thank you, Jesus. I appreciate that. And we're getting some wonderful themes that people are reflecting on the chat about the need to be proactive, but also reflective. And then how do we work within some of the sometimes more rigid structures at our institutions to embrace this futurist thinking and being agile and adapting to the moment. I'll next invite Dr. Harvey Charles to give his reflections.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And we're focusing on emerging themes and the kind of foresight we need to succeed in this space. But I think that many of the things we need to concern ourselves with aren't necessarily new. For example, the need to think more broadly about internationalization and as the American Council of Education has dubbed it, comprehensive internationalization. I have come to believe that this is the transformative work of the 21st century. And certainly the Academy has a leading role to play in helping to articulate and facilitate comprehensive internationalization in support of global learning and in support of global research. Unfortunately, we have seen a stubborn commitment almost to thinking of internationalization in terms of student mobility. And there is no question, especially given what our previous speakers have talked about, that student mobility will continue to be a dominant aspect of internationalization going forward. And a lot of good things will continue to emerge from student mobility. But internationalization is so much more than that. It certainly involves the kind of vision and mission and commitments that institutions articulate for themselves. It concerns the role of the faculty in facilitating global learning experiences for students, the kind of infrastructure we create to support this kind of work. And this has to be something to which we pay attention and give emphasis going forward. I'd also like to add that internationalization, unfortunately, is not always a positive thing. And that is so when it suppresses the voices of those who are marginalized in society. It is antithetical, actually, to the values of higher education to marginalize certain voices while privileging others. And so as international educators, we should be particularly keen on ensuring that we create spaces so that we can have a comprehensive dialogue, a dialogue where all voices can be heard. Comprehensive internationalization actually works best in an ecosystem of collaboration. And what comes to mind when I think of collaboration are the academic alliances established in the European Union over the past 5 years. I happen to be part of 2 of these alliances, and so I've gained some insight, and I've actually learned a lot and believe that there are many lessons that we in the United States and elsewhere can learn from this experiment, if you will. These groupings of universities come together. They are engaged in a shared vision to enhance their research and teaching and to learn from one another, and hopefully to advance together as academic enterprises. And of course, the impulse to compete is strong and deep, and we will probably never eliminate competition in our interactions. And frankly, there are times and situations where competition can actually be quite healthy. However, I believe that we have known for a very long time that collaboration can be incredibly effective in helping us to realize the goals and objectives that we set for ourselves. In fact, I like to think of the recent pandemic with COVID, where the race for a cure, for therapies, for vaccines started as soon as we came to understand how problematic this was, not just for the citizens of one nation, but for the world. And so scientists, researchers got together and collaborated again in order to find solutions. And so I really believe that going forward, that collaboration should be at the center of what we do as international educators to advance our work and to have the kinds of partnerships that would help us realize the objectives that we set for ourselves in terms of student learning and in terms of innovation and discovery. Funding continues to be a challenge, and I think it's impossible to talk about internationalization and not acknowledge how critical this is to the extent to which we're able to succeed in the important work that we do. The academic alliances in the European Union are thriving because this has become there is a political commitment to this project. The European Union has determined that as part of its ongoing effort to foster integration politically and economically, that it is important to do this work in terms of the academy as well. And so funding is available to facilitate this work. And I desperately want to see our values here in the United States changed around this issue, because without the requisite resources, it's really important for us. It's really difficult for us to succeed in this very important agenda. Sadly, too many offices of international education are perceived as revenue centers exclusively, and much of the revenue is used to support other aspects or areas of the university and not necessarily to support and advance the work of internationalization. And so this is something we really have to turn our attention to. And I guess finally, I would say something about the need for cross-cultural understanding. That's very core to the business that we're in as international educators. And when I think of this, the one thing that always comes to mind is William Fulbright and his legacy of the Fulbright Fellowship Program launched in 1949. And he felt the need to launch this program because of the trauma induced by World War II and the fact that so many lives were lost. And there were so many combatants who simply didn't understand one another, or maybe knew very little, if anything, of one another, but it was important to fight. And he felt that maybe if we had a chance to interact with one another, engage with one another, teach alongside each other, engage in research activity, maybe we can, through this understanding, come to the realization that conflict is not necessarily a thing that must be done to solve problems. And I think he was on the right track, although the events of the past 70, 75 years demonstrate that we still find a way to engage in conflict as opposed to engaging in debate and respectful dialogue, even when some of the ideas shared may seem offensive to us. And in this time of war, and there are a couple of them going on in the world right now, I think it is even more incumbent on us, and including international educators, to find ways to circumvent the misunderstandings that currently exist in our communities, and to find ways to breach the walls and the barriers that prevent us from understanding one another. And frankly, these are the values I believe that have been part of the academy and that has helped the academy to survive and endure for centuries. And so we have an obligation as international educators to continue to foreground and foster strategies to support cross-cultural understanding so that we can ultimately have a more peaceful, a more prosperous, and a better world.
Well, thank you, Harvey, for tying that so nicely to NAFSA's mission and our stated values as well. And you're talking about collaboration really leads us well into our next remarks from Fanta, who, since she's come on board here at NAFSA as our CEO, has really talked a lot about the importance of collaboration, both on the staff, with our partners, with our members, and in so many different ways. So Fanta, I'll invite you to turn your camera on and join us back. And while she's doing that, I will just acknowledge that there's a bunch of you out there have let us know that you've set up opportunities to watch this in collaboration with other people in your offices. And that's just so nice to think about you there, sharing this experience together. I hope you'll put some questions in the chat for our panelists as well. Fanta, so good to see you. Thank you so much. And let's hear your perspectives on what some of our colleagues have shared.
Yeah, no, thank you. And really thank you to all of our colleagues from TESA to Marcus, Jesus, and Harvey. I will sort of, summarize our conversation in the following way. Tessa talked about the fact that, future and foresight is really, it's different from sort of how we think of predictions. And that there's a science to this, there's also an art to it. And that ultimately it is about the choices that we make and what that leads us. My reflection is really a couple of things. One is that if the past is an indicator of where we are and where we may be going, there are a couple of things that I think I want to make sure we can all agree on. One is that what may be potentially an existing issue for us, which is really this piece of what I would call the center of gravity. I've argued that the center of gravity is shifting and that it has been shifting for a while. The same way I think Jesus has argued that with technology is going at the speed of light in a way that makes it even ever more challenging for us to be able to catch up. I will also argue that this center of gravity that has been shifting is shifting rapidly. It is what I call the problem of the emperor with no clothes. Everyone sees the emperor with no clothes except for the emperor. And the analogy that I will use in this instance is that it is safe to say that as we think about where we've been in terms of international education and where we're going with 2030 and beyond, the issue and the notion that the West is going to be the epicenter, I think we need to really, in many ways, check our reality about that. It is no secret that the Global South is on the rise, and the Global South is absolutely very present in ways that has yet to be acknowledged, and it would be a tremendous mistake on the part of us as international educators to not acknowledge that, but more importantly, to do what Harvey talked about, which is we need to move to truly a model that is much more collaborative than it's been. Because the notion of competition is a mindset of scarcity. And I've argued before that that mindset of scarcity does not serve us well. And not only does it not serve us well, we've got to move to a mindset of more abundance in order to know how we can get to a much more equitable place. So first and foremost, the center of gravity is shifting as we speak. And with this shifting center of gravity is going to decenter the West. That is simply a fact. It is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. And I would argue that when is actually right in front of us. So that's one thing. And our ability to understand and appreciate that would serve us well. Second is demography is destiny. And with aging populations that we have seen, and Marcus has talked about the demographic shift. In the case of the US, we're talking about demographic cliff in terms of higher education, but then with the demographic cliff, it is also compounded by an aging population, and immigration is absolutely a necessity. It is a necessity in so many parts of the West. And where are those immigrants going to be coming from? I think we all know the answer to that. Once again, reaffirming that we are absolutely interconnected, whether we recognize it or not. So with demography as a destiny, we also will witness within international education an increasing phenomenon of refugees, climate refugees, and refugees of all sorts. How we in higher education respond to that will be one of the telling signs of how we've evolved as a field or not. But I think we can anticipate a rise in refugees of all sorts in terms of our borders. So demography is destiny is my second argument. Harvey talked about internationalization. And again, with internationalization, it has evolved. Even our notion of comprehensive internationalization has evolved. We have scholars now who have really pushed us to think and to reassess what we actually mean by internationalization, and that the notion of internationalization without talking about equity and justice is incomplete, a framework of internationalization, and that we are called to really be thinking about how we understand the world and how we navigate the world as part of our framework for how we think about internationalization beyond the processes of internationalization and the structures that we have in our institution. So the notion of internationalization is evolving. I would also argue that in order to do the work that we've talked about, whether we're looking at the role of technology that can be an enabling force if we know how to leverage it, and the fact that we have to embrace it while also being very mindful of the potential, sort of challenges that could come with it. I would indicate that geopolitics is absolutely going to be even more pronounced as we move forward. It's no secret we're already looking at elections in many parts of the world. It is no secret that the geopolitics are so fraught in the environment that we're in that it is a destabilizing force for all of us coming out of COVID. And we can anticipate that geopolitics is going to continue to play a major part as we move forward with internationalization. And the question that will come up is, for those of us who are in internationalization, what will be the mitigating forces that we'll have as tools in our toolbox to assist us with that problem as we move forward? Lastly, let me talk about the fact that we need to be able to shed old ways of thinking in order to make space for new ways of thinking. And this is going to require a renaissance in our field. And that renaissance is going to require a generation of international educators who will be coming in with a very different orientation than certainly my generation has been. And it is going to behoove us to not only acknowledge that, but to embrace that, the sooner the better for all of us as we think about what's happening in our field. We're seeing a lot of shifting. We're seeing many professionals who either are rethinking, re-envisioning, and reimagining what the field is. And it is also the case that there will be probably new jobs that will come in the field of international education that we have yet to imagine. And so that is what I see as we move forward and as we think about the work. And lastly, we will have to think about how we merge the different paradigms of DEI and international education. At NAFSA, we wrote a blog and where I argued that it's two sides of the same coin. And I think this is going to become even more prevalent as we've talked about the fact that we're going to be facing a demographic shift. We're going to be facing a center of gravity that will be shifting for us, that our notion of internationalizations are going to evolve at a speed of light, and that there will be a need to shed in order to have the renaissance that we've talked about. So with that, I will stop there, Caroline, and open it up because I'm sure that folks have a lot of reflections to provide.
Thank you, Fanta. And the blog post that Fanta mentioned is posted in the chat by my colleague, Dale. I'll invite you all to turn your cameras back on now for our panelists and remind our audience that if you do have questions, please pop them into the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. Hi, folks. And so one of the questions I have for you is just a quick reflection about success, right? We're talking about success for the future. So thinking ahead the next, 5 years or so, what does success look like? And I'm going to ask you to be quick on this one. I'll start with Marcus. Quick reflection. What does success look like? It's hard to even say, let alone think about in a few years down the road.
Well, I think given everything we've just said, a key thing, of course, it's always been success, more youth access to international education, whether on-site and offline. That's one key thing. More inclusion and equity as well on a global scale. Also, a better connection between the degree programs and the study programs and degrees and the demand in the employment market. That's always been the case, but it's going to be even more the case in future. And then finally, I would also say more global understanding so that we can come together and collaborate, as Harvey said, to tackle the real problems of humanity, which are displacement of people due to wars, due to the environment. I think that's the key thing. If we get it right in international education, that global understanding will be better.
That picks up on so many of the themes that Fanta mentioned about access and inclusion, marrying these different ideas together. Jesus, what about for you? Success in a nutshell. It's a hard question.
To me, success looks like this. Higher education leaders, government officials, and industry leaders leading the way in creating policy and implementing these technologies and modalities to help, like Marcus mentioned, to minimize or eliminate that digital equity gap and to create more opportunities for people globally.
I love a charge to leadership. That's great, a way to think about it, right? On those different ways that people can be involved. Harvey, what about for you?
I think of three things when I think of success in this space. First, the notion that internationalization is fundamental to human survival. And I think if we think of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, it becomes readily apparent that at the heart of all of that is the work of internationalization. The second is wrapping our arms around the idea that internationalization is a critical dimension of the transformative work that has to happen in the academy in the 21st century. And I think some regions of the world are doing this a lot better than others, certainly than the United States. But internationalization is transformative work. And the third is that to the extent that we can succeed at institutionalizing internationalization, I think we truly would have succeeded. So we're not trying to have strategic planning around it anymore. It is just part of the landscape. We've accepted it and it is normative.
Thank you. I like that call to how we might not be the leaders, and we can look to other countries and perhaps humble ourselves in what we can learn from those experiences, rather than just assuming, as some of you have said, that this is the way to do it without considering and changing that center of gravity, as you've mentioned, Fanta. So maybe I'll go to Fanta to you next.
Yeah, no, I think my colleagues covered it. What would come to mind for me, Caroline, in terms of thinking of success, it would be wonderful if we could get to the place of the same way that we have just taken for granted that learning to read and math is foundational, that international education is just foundational. That would be success to me. And that would then, I think, go back to what Harvey talked about, would ensure that we really, in many ways, have socialized it and that it is part of the DNA of how we think about basic education. That would be, for me, a marker of success. The second marker of success is our ability to get to the place where we can, on an everyday basis, talk about, as Harvey and others talked about, the transformative nature of our work. And that is really the social impact part of our work. That it is not about activities, but that those activities actually leads to specific outcomes, and that those outcomes in many ways make the everyday lives of people much better, because their social mobility has enhanced their ability, as Tessa gave the example, of a better life, and that better life has accrued in so many ways to society. It is my hope and aspiration that would be a marker for me of success.
So we'll see more stories like the one Tessa shared in the beginning, perhaps. Tessa, I'll have you have the last word then about the future, because you've been thinking about this quite a lot.
Well, mine is probably going to mirror what Harvey and Fanta were saying. I think success would look like turning the value proposition outward and shaping the conversation outside of the education system about how international education is a critical skill of the future for everybody. Companies, governments, foundations, every kind of institution needs to have this be part of their blood, essentially. So turning the value proposition, the dialogue outward, and having that leadership outside of the education zone.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a few questions that I've already noted coming in, but one question I actually want to ask the audience with a poll, Madeline, if you could pull up our poll, is that several of you have mentioned AI this afternoon, and I want to get a pulse on whether you, our audience, or community is already using AI models in your work, such as ChatGPT or Bard. Have you never used them? Every once in a while, once a day? I know Jesus was interested to see how many of us are really using these before. And I'll admit that I haven't fully explored myself how AI could be used in my office space to support my work. And it looks to me, the poll that I'm seeing so far is many of you haven't really fully embraced how you might use that in the office. And maybe we just need a few examples of how that would be used in the office. I shared earlier, I often use it to write a poem, but that's not going to necessarily help me get my work done today, Fanta. So having some other ideas about how we might use it. I'm going to end this poll and share. Madeline, can you share the results? Thank you. Jesus, for people like me who haven't used AI a lot in the office, what is the risk of my not embracing this more and learning more how to use it?
Yeah, I mean, like we discussed earlier, AI it's here to stay. It's like whether we like it or not, whether if we find it useful or not, that won't change that fact. And I think that some of the risks that I see here is, well, number one, is becoming outdated. I get this question a lot: is AI going to replace me? The answer is no. It's not going to replace you, but our peers who use AI will be able to, or will likely replace us, because now they'll have more tools to do what we do faster, better, and that's the challenge, right? So if you're not careful, you will end up being outdated. The same way that we cannot fathom the idea of doing the work that we do today without a computer or internet, right? Another risk is it's becoming irrelevant, which is a little bit different than just the replacing or substitution. There's absolutely no doubt that there is value in higher education in what we do. At Coursera, for example, we continually hear from employers telling us we need your graduates to have soft skills, communication, and becoming or being human, right? And being human will become a more valuable commodity in the future, right, as these technologies evolve. But if we decide not to adapt, we'll be left behind, again, by other institutions or organizations that are doing what we're doing, but better, right? So I think those are, I mean, in addition to obviously the digital equity gap widening, that will be, the other two risks that I see.
Marcus, how about you? And maybe, can you give an example at ISEP of how you might be using this technology in the workplace, or what you hope to be doing with it in the future?
Well, we don't pull out ChatGPT every 5 minutes and ask questions, if that's what you mean. But I think, we say use AI, Siri, Alexa, many tools that we all use every day. We've been using AI for quite a while. So when one says use AI, we think of specifically, these specific examples like writing poems or stuff. I would say that AI is all around us. And rather than saying use AI, I would say use technology. So at ISEP, we use all kinds of technologies, all kinds of applications. And I think that in our work, in the work of international education, recruiters or educators, I think should always stay abreast of technology, see what technology is coming into their field. Just like, architects, designers, engineers, maybe 20, 30 years ago, would be using pencils and calculators or rudimentary computers, now work on very high-tech programs. And you can't be an architect without knowing how to use those programs. That's what I would maybe say to the audience is don't be left behind by saying, oh, I can't do that. I do the old way, because you will face extinction. It's more seeing what programs come into your particular field, which help you reduce inefficiencies, help you do more with less work, help you save time, and help you do a better job. I think when you use such tools, you can get rid of tedious tasks and focus more on the human element. Look more at what the student needs and focus more on helping the student and their outcome.
Thank you. Maybe something those who are a little bit more hesitant with the technology, something we can take away today is to try it. I was at a great regional NAFSA conference recently, and one of the sessions that I went to, she actually gave me and the audience some ideas like, Caroline, you can ask it to summarize this article that you want to read, or find you the top 10 research articles on XYZ, and having those examples and thinking about the way that it's already surrounding us, like you said, Marcus, does make it feel more approachable, and how can I use it from work rather than be used by it. So I appreciate that. One of the questions I want to ask, and it comes from a reflection that one of our colleagues put in the chat, was about disrupting existing structures and the rigidity of those structures. So maybe my question is for Tessa and Harvey. I'll start maybe with Harvey. Oftentimes in higher education, we have this perception of it being very rigid and slow to change. A large institution like the University of Minnesota, as innovative as it is, I'm sure there are moments where the slowness to adapt and the rigidity of it make it difficult to apply these future thinking ideas. How do people work within that and work around that? If you could give us some thoughts. And then Tessa, building on that, perhaps, what do we do with those rigid structures to make this worthwhile? Harvey?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I like to characterize higher education as one of the most conservative institutions in our society. It's been that way for a very, very long time. And I've had my own experiences where I've tried to introduce new ideas, new ways of doing things. And many of the people have been resistant to that. And so I would say that the willingness to engage with new ideas really varies from institution to institution. However, I think a strategy that can always win is to find ways to connect your new ideas with institutional priorities. And of course, we find those priorities in the strategic plan, or if we think that maybe we need to create new strategies or new priorities for the institution, try to make yourself part of the process that is involved in strategic planning. And of course, with new presidents coming on board every 5 years, if not less, there are always opportunities for the SIO to be engaged in strategic planning. But if you can find ways to link your new ideas to the priorities articulated by an institution, it becomes easier for the decision makers to see value in what you're proposing. And it is possible to have some success there.
I'm hearing some of the key skills that we like to talk about in the relationship building, but also the communication and having the leadership to make those connections and speaking the language of the strategic planners as well, rather than using the jargon that I'll say, I think we often fall into in international education. Tessa, what about you? And working with these rigid structures, what are some thoughts that you might have?
Well, firstly, this is the meat of the work, and this is where things get really very, very challenging, and it can be very frustrating as well. The short answer, and in reality, it's never quite this straightforward, is engage with your stakeholders so that they're the ones that have the ideas. So when we use strategic foresight, the goal is not to come with a fully baked thing of like, this is the future direction that we need to go into, this is what's happening. It's to walk the path alongside the stakeholders, and particularly the skeptics, the ones that are most conservative or unwilling to explore new ideas. Of course, getting skeptics on board, how you actually go about organizing this group, getting people's time and attention, that's where things get very tricky and complicated. But using the future as a tool to do this is a very safe thing to do. And there's a lot of legwork to educate people on what this whole space is so that there is appetite for it. But because the future doesn't exist, it's not saying, look, now this is what we're doing and we have to do it this way and these are the risks and oh my God, this is changes. It's rather saying, here's a space that doesn't actually exist. And it's our playground to explore different possibilities without having to put anything behind it. We don't have to invest our time and our money beyond the actual process of exploring the possibilities. And in that, allowing the new ideas to emerge outside of a single person, but as part of the broader set of stakeholders. And of course, as I said, the challenge is how do you gather the stakeholders in an effective way and get buy-in into the process? And that takes a lot of work.
Maybe I'll ask Fanta to reflect on that. Fanta, I think one of your skills is building these groups of stakeholders and identifying the right people to go in that conversation. How have you built that? Because as Tessa's saying, it doesn't cost money to necessarily do this, but there's a talent and there's a time that you have to set aside for that.
I think what comes to mind in relations to that, Caroline, is you have to be able to build trust. And so that dimension of trust, I think, is incredibly important. And along with that dimension of trust is one of the things that we talked about. And that is that there has to be a sense of shared ownership in that it is not a zero-sum game. Because as soon as people see it as a zero-sum game, then you're done, right? So there has to be a sense of win-win for everyone that's involved. And also this notion that if, in fact, we're willing to imagine that where we are currently, we can actually get to a better place. And that better place will actually benefit all of us in multiple ways. So that's what comes to mind for me whenever I've been able to bring stakeholders together, is really to sort of say, as Tessa said, you have to have the stake low enough for people to trust and to begin to look at it. But they have to have the imagination to believe that in working together, it actually can lead to a better place. And it can lead to much more of a win-win than a zero-sum game. And this is where I think the importance of influence versus power is incredibly important. And they're very different. They really are very fundamentally different.
Thank you. Thanks all so much. One of the questions came in that I think, Jesus, you'd like to answer for the poll, for the audience. So let me read that out. The question has to do with some of the information that's come out in Monday's Open Doors. And specifically, the question is, what needs to change to measurably increase acceptance and access for more students at academic institutions and give them more opportunities to see the world beyond their campus and their home community. Jesus, would you like to take us through that?
Yes, and I mean, I'm not an expert in this answer, but I will put, I'll share my 2 cents. I think that if we look at those numbers, and we're all familiar with those figures, there's a very small percentage of students that actually get the opportunity to have that international experience. And what a lot of people are proposing with these new technologies, and there's several modalities like Marcus mentioned earlier as well, is to widen the opportunity for people to have an international experience, not necessarily by traveling, but perhaps at home, right? And there are different modalities that could be used. one that we've been exploring, and we're really putting a lot of resources and time into exploring more. It's COIL, Collaborative Online International Learning, which has been around for a while. It's nothing new. There are plenty of experts out there that are practicing it, but it will be an opportunity for you to offer an international experience, not just to those students that want to have that international experience, but to even make it part of the curriculum, like we discussed earlier, right? To be part of the experience of higher education. So the technology does allow for us to do more right now, but we need to be intentional, and we need to figure out ways to actually make it work. So we have some tools available to us. It's a matter of how are we going to utilize them in order to make that, or to bring that to happen.
And just, Caroline, I want to add
Yeah.
to what Jesus talked about. I think COIL is a perfect example of that. To some extent, we're still living in the sort of universe of zero-sum game, right? Coming out of COVID, I think there is a mindset that, oh my goodness, if we scale up COIL, then this would mean that, maybe there'll be less students. That is simply not the case. There will always be, and there's enough students to go around in terms of students who wish to go overseas. And by the same token, we have a social responsibility as a field to make international education more accessible. And part of that answer is COIL. And yet there's a lot of resistance when you bring it up to institutions to really, in many ways, venture in that direction. So this is, to me, one of those examples, again, of it's sort of, well, if we move in this direction, it means this other piece may be, reduced. That's just not the case.
And as you were saying, some students are going to avail themselves to this opportunity. Some are not. And it's those ones who are not that we need to find different ways of reaching, because there's the access issue, the equity issue, all of those things. But the students who aren't walking in the door or joining the conversation are perhaps those who would most benefit from these opportunities to connect in different ways. We've seen the power of that, I'm sure, in all of our own lives and our experiences, and would want that to happen for others. Let's see, I had another question that we've touched on in this topic of equity in the US. Fonta, you mentioned it. We're talking about a demographic cliff. Marcus, you talked about a demographic explosion. And I think tied up in this is that issue of equity and center of gravity that you mentioned, right? Where you're sitting and how this looks and how it's so very, very different. How do we, as that shifts, how do we get a bigger perspective on the demographic cliff and explosion are different parts of the same coin, different sides of this coin. And so how do we work on the equity issue, balancing the needs in one place with what we see as the opportunity maybe for some of those students to come to the United States or participate with us in online learning? Marcus, can I ask you to talk a little bit more about how that's looking from your perspective, and when you mentioned the demographic explosion?
Yes, well, what Fran said before was very interesting. I like the parable, the emperor has no clothes, because the emperor doesn't see himself or herself that he's naked. What she said is very true. In fact, in about 20 years, China, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, the GDP of those countries will be double the GDP of the G7 countries, the world as we know it. And it's going to happen very, very fast. So I think that we should be very aware of this. Of course, that we also maintain our place in the world, and that we help these countries as they develop, that to what Harvey said, that we put in place collaborations that we don't become insignificant ourselves, and that we create together this whole new world is going to come whether we like it or not. So, I mean, yes, now the US, luckily we saw the numbers which came out of the Open Doors report the other day. That's very, very satisfying to see that US is back to #1, the place it's always been for the last 50 years. But the world as we know it is about to change quite radically. And I think we should all be very much prepared for that. And as we know this, prepare the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Fonta, this center of gravity shift and how it fits into this discussion a little bit more.
Yeah, no, and it'd be great for Harvey also and others to chime in, but the way I see the center of gravity shifting as well, it also means that there will be a shift of how we understand knowledge and how knowledge is produced and by whom, right? And I think that's the other part of this as well, as this unfolds. And we're going back to conversations about indigenous knowledge. We're going back to conversations about how there's, how we really, in many ways, in order to solve the critical issues of our time, they do not know borders, right? And that is going to take, again, this notion of collaboration that we've talked about, Caroline. So our ability to bring in and to create this bigger tent that I've often talked about is very much needed. And it is not one to fear, because it is often the fear of the other, but rather to understand that the other is us in many ways. That's, to me, is where I see the opportunity for how we think about the center of gravity shifting. And again, it's not a matter of zero-sum game. In order for some to win, some are to lose, but rather to say that in order for me to be able to exist, it cannot be divorced from the existence of the other. That, to me, is how I'm thinking about the center of gravity shifting that we've talked about, and why I think that matters so much in the way in which we're talking about it in this instance. Similarly, we cannot, negate the fact that the world is ever more polarized. And many of us have argued that the antidote to polarization is international education. It really is. So as the center of gravity is shifting, which means our notion of how we understand the world has to evolve and shift, it also gives us the opportunity then to know, how do we reconcile these polar opposite? And so there's an opportunity for us to really think differently. And in many ways, not only to think differently, to be different in the world is what I see as I think about the shift in the center of gravity. And I think for those of us who have been international students in different parts, we know that that is part of the course. And it's about adaptation.
Harvey, can I just, earlier you mentioned the collaboration piece, and I know when we were talking and planning this, you mentioned two specific examples that you're involved with that have helped look at the issues we're talking about from different angles. Can you talk a little bit more about those two initiatives?
Absolutely. I'm part of ARCUS and also part of Aurora. And these involve collections of universities from different different countries within the EU who come together and who commit themselves to find ways to collaborate around teaching and research. And, it's not a collaboration, or it's not an alliance only in name. I mean, these communities, which would be another way to characterize them, these communities engage in deep and significant work. And actually, much of the work is done in the context of what they call work packages. And so they address a number of aspects of the functioning of their respective institutions and find ways to achieve a shared understanding as to how they can advance or move further along in terms of the various ways in which they're collaborating. And it's really fascinating as an outsider to look in at the kinds of things that they're doing and recognize that, number one, they've been able to achieve so much in just a relatively short period of time, and then to envision where these institutions would be 10, 15, 20 years from now. And sometimes I engage in a thought experiment and I say to myself, what would happen if we establish these kinds of alliances, but did it not just within the United States, but say within North America? So we bring Mexican and American and Canadian institutions together, using the alliances as a framework for further collaboration. And what might happen, for example, if we did this on a global scale? Right now, we're dealing with the issue of securitization, where the United States and many Western nations believe that our enemies are stealing our intellectual capital, so to speak, to use so that they can compete with us and get a leg up on us, or to use this knowledge for military purposes to attack us. All right, and this is the belief in some quarters in Western society, and I often wonder, what if we were to collaborate with some of these nations that we think are out to steal what we have? And why should we be assuming that we will always be on top? in terms of having the best science and the best knowledge. That isn't necessarily a guarantee. So it seems to me, coming back to the whole notion of these alliances, at the heart of what they do is collaborating with one another to create a better future for the citizens of the European Union. And if somehow we can find ways to transplant that fairly simple idea, actually, to other parts of the world, I think that there is something about that that would be good for us.
So approaching things with a little bit less fear and a little less ego in what we might learn from each other in these situations. I mean, you see that in so many ways, that when you bring more diverse stakeholders to the table, it might take you a little longer to get to that solution, but the solution is so much more innovative and different and outward looking than the one person would have come up with, or people who were all coming from the same place. We're getting close on our time, and I want to take one of the questions here that I really liked about, let me see here. People coming into the field nowadays, because Fanta, you also mentioned newer professionals, incoming professionals in the skills. So, darn it. How do you think our professional roles in international education are going to be changing over the next 5 years? How are we going to skill ourselves up to what we need to be doing towards this future as we move towards 2030? Any ideas for the newer professionals, and for those of us who maybe aren't some new but want to keep pace with those newer professionals and the rest of our time in our careers? Ideas for the new emerging professionals. Tessa?
I'm sorry, I was actually about to answer one of the questions in here because
okay.
I didn't see that you were asking it. So I kind of missed the question you were asking, if you don't mind rephrasing it.
No, it was about, and maybe that's why I had a minute difficulty finding the question. Advice for the newer professional who's coming into the professional space now, be it higher education, international education, or people like myself who are definitely not new to the field, but want to keep pace in order to keep fresh within this. Advice for the incoming professional to this idea.
Well, I mean, yes. So in my experience, incoming professionals usually have the upper hand because you are not mired down by all of the legacy patterns and barriers and expectations and biases and assumptions. So you have an open mind. And the advice is try and keep that mind open and not adapt yourself to the people around you and the institutions around you. Continue to bring the external perspective that you had before you joined in. Keep those contacts, keep your foot in both worlds, if you will. And for people who are later in their career, it's then the kind of the opposite thing is work your way outside of your network and your day-to-day. And if you have the benefit of doing with a group of people, all the better. If you can somehow gather a group of people in your team to gain some new skills with you, that will make it so much more powerful. And with strategic foresight in particular, if you want to engage in futures thinking, if you can do it as a team, so you're not the only person who is learning the new skills, the new language, the new methodologies, essentially, you'll be able to go so much further. So seek allies as you try and shape the future.
Anyone else, Marcus, Jesus, want to offer a perspective that's maybe not so close to international education in the same way that I might be here at NAFSA on this new professionals? Because I certainly think that a lot as a professional association are new professionals entering the field.
I think what Tessa said is very true. I mean, bring the fresh air that you were hired for into the institution, and then for fear of being repetitive, embrace new technologies, and also follow continued development, professional development, because I think that's the most important thing for all of us, whether you're a starter or somebody who's been in the job for a long time, is to always stay abreast of developments and try to help shape the university as it moves into the new world. I mean, if you think about it, for the last 1,000 years, universities have been about people coming to listen to one person standing in a hall in an auditorium and saying something, and that's completely changed. Now, as we just talked about it today, learning happens in so many shapes and forms, and so you have to bring that mindset with you to help the university to evolve into this new university.
And
Please.
Sorry, and I just wanted to add that when it comes to, it is a challenge, right? It more than just the technology and knowing what to do, it's also the organizational culture of the institutions that you're working with, right? So that dictates a lot of what you can and cannot do. But, as a professional, I would say trying to stay up to date with the trends and especially the technologies, because that might open up an opportunity for you to begin changing that organizational culture and to be the pioneer in your organization, to actually lead the way in how things could be different and could be better. Like that, it's challenging, but it's not just a challenge that higher education faces when people are hired for their talent, but then they're not led, they can't exercise that talent. They're not empowered to actually use the talent. So it's a challenge, right? Finding the right organization, finding the right leadership. It's more than just having the right tools and knowing what to do. But I wish there was an easier answer, but it is complicated.
Well, thank you. We're to the point where I get to ask about closing remarks, and I'll do that by way of saying, and if your closing remarks you want to offer some thoughts on this young professional or newer professional, I'll call them, to our field, right? They might not be young, they might be old, but they are just new to this conversation. So you can do that. But what are some of the things that you want to leave us with, thinking that we haven't had a chance to talk about today as we think towards the future of international education? What haven't we had the chance that we can maybe leave here and ask the question to AI or think about for our next discussion? Would anyone like to go first? Fanta, thank you.
I'll go first. I mean, I think when all is said and done, there's the Chinese sign that talks about how change is about danger and opportunity. That is how I think about this, right? I think we have some choices that we can make. I don't see this as doom and gloom at all. I think that we have lots of possibilities here, and it's a matter of what choices we're willing to make and what risk we're willing to take, in order to achieve that. So that's what I'm leaving our conversation understanding and continuing to appreciate.
I would invite everyone to, like we've discussed, to start thinking on international higher education, international opportunities, not as for those that 5% that we already work with.
Correct. Yeah. So
international education for everyone. How, in the next 10 years, 15 years, how can we make that possible? Whether it's just, with small steps or, little experiences, but let's just try to do it to make it available to everyone, not just those that want to study abroad or are interested in it.
I visited a campus a few years ago and found out that the tagline for that institution was to make life better. And that has stayed with me for all of these years, because I believe that at the end of the day, that is what we're trying to achieve. We are engaged in the work of preparing our students to be globally competent so that they can make their own lives better and they can contribute to a better life. We're engaged in global research in order to make life better for humanity around the world. And I think that if we keep that at the center of our work on campuses as international educators to make life better, I think we can live lives of purpose, and we can live lives that can also facilitate transformation.
I would quickly add that, and I put this in one of the answers on the Q&A, and this is for everybody. The world is getting increasingly complex and complicated, and new tools like generative AI are just going to make our work harder for the time being. We are so distracted, emails, IM, this, that, the other, that it's very hard to set aside the time to do deep work where you're actually gaining new knowledge and not just routing new information to people. And so our biggest challenge is to reconsider how we work and really what tools are critical and necessary. Do we need to be on IM all the time, email all the time, whatever it might be, phone all the time? And read the book Deep Work by Cal Newport to get some inspiration for how to think about restructuring your daily rhythms of work so that you can go deep and do the hard work that is in front of you in order to build a better world. You can't do that just by sending emails and routing information. It's going to really require us to pull up our sleeves.
I know we're going to get asked the name of that book again. Was Deep Work by
Cal Newport. I'll put it in the chat here.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask also for our audience, just by way of closing out, to type into our chat the takeaway that you'll bring back to your institution today. I wrote down that I am going to make an effort to work outside my network, which is hard for me, Tessa, but for some of these things that I'm a little bit nervous about learning, it would help if I sought out people to learn that with, and that would help me go into this new space. So that's what I'm going to take away from this conversation. I'd love for the rest of you to share some of that as well. Today we tried to put links in our chat to some of the resources, to the book, to the blogs, and other things that people have mentioned, those collaborative efforts that Dr. Charles shared. And we'll send that out with the recording as well. I also wanted to highlight for you a few things that are coming up from NAFSA that really do touch on some of the themes that we've had today over the next few weeks. On November 28th, NAFSA will have an online dialogue focused on, and Marcus, you'll be interested in this, facilitating effective data transfer. And during that live online event, representatives from different international organizations are going to discuss advancing digital student data mobility. So I'm excited to learn about that. Then the very next day, on November 29th, there'll be an online program about recognizing innovation in international education research. And it's specifically focused on equity and access to international education opportunities at community colleges, based on a recent paper that one of our award-winning members wrote for our Trends and Insights series. And then the next day, November 30th, so that last week of November is busy for NAFSA. It's the 4th installment of our series on NAFSA's international education professional competencies. And I've heard a variety of those competencies come up and mentioned in today: relationship building, communications, inclusion and equity, leadership, developing people, etc. This particular session is going to focus on compliance management, relationship cultivation, risk assessment, and crisis management. Each of those 3 November programs I mentioned are about an hour long, and they're free for NAFSA members, and they're all online. We'll hope you'll join us. Registration, you'll find the links in the chat. And finally, our theme today was about advancing the mission of international education in the future. And I would be remiss if I didn't highlight an opportunity for our community to advocate directly for that future during our Advocacy Day program, which is held in March over 2 days. And registration for that Advocacy Day, one of our most popular programs, is open now. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists and to thank my staff friends who've been helping out today: Dale, Joanne, Andrew, and Maddie in the background, making sure everything works smoothly. Thanks to each of you. And thank you again for joining us as we celebrate International Education Week and NAFSA's 75th anniversary. It's our NAFSA-versary. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. Very much appreciate you. Thank you.